The Battle of Stalingrad was one of, if not the most bloody battle in human history, fought from the 23rd of August 1942 until the 2nd of February 1943. This battle was a key turning point on the Eastern Front and marked the decline of the Wehrmacht. The crushing defeat at this bombed-out wasteland of concrete and steel would halt the Axis advance and turn the tide against them. The intention behind the seizure of Stalingrad was mainly to hold the area for control of the oil fields farther to the south. These oil fields, in the Caucasus, were key to the Red Army. They supplied much of the oil needed for their armored divisions and air force. Because of this, Hitler was keen to attempt to seize these in order to weaken the Soviets. The Germans had been repelled at Moscow, only a few miles from the city, and were now unable to capture the capital due to Soviet reinforcements, even with the help of Hungarian, Croatian, and Italian allies. The Red Army had modernized and was now much better prepared than it had been during the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, which had lost it millions of men. With new T-34 tanks and Yak-9 fighter planes, the Soviet forces were much better equipped to counter and repel the invaders. However, their ability to use these vehicles would be compromised if the Germans managed to seize their oil fields. To achieve this end, the 4th Panzer Army, Hungarian 2nd Army, several Italian infantry divisions, the 17th Army, 1st Panzer Army, and 6th Army were sent to the southeastern front. By the end of July, the Germans had managed to push across the Don River and were only 40 miles from the Volga River. Hitler had ordered that the force be split into two groups, the second of which, Group B, would be tasked with capturing Stalingrad. This force was mainly made up of the 4th Panzer Army and the German 6th Army. However, the Soviet forces were in swift retreat, and no matter how quickly the Wehrmacht would advance, the Soviets would evade them. Some hoped the war would soon be over. However, this was certainly not the case. As the Germans drew closer to the city, the Russians began to fortify their homes. Stalingrad was a large industrial town named after the Soviet leader himself. This model of an ideal communist city had broad modern streets and a grid of large rectangular apartment buildings. To the north, a rail depot, a tractor factory, and several other such large industrial facilities were a symbol of Soviet pride and the success of communism. South of the city stood a huge grain elevator, which was not only symbolic, but also was an important strategic resource for the Russians. The area surrounding these two parts of the city, there was a large array of crudely constructed wooden shacks as well as workers' housing, beyond which were fields. Across the Volga, which could only be crossed by ferry, was a number of depots and munition caches, as well as a large battery of both anti-aircraft and traditional artillery. Inside the city, preparations were being made for the coming battle. Grain, cattle, and other strategic resources were shipped across the Volga, winning the Soviets a harvest victory before the battle had even started. The civilians, however, were not evacuated. Stalin said the soldiers would fight harder for a live city than for a dead one. Women and children were tasked with digging trenches and setting up defensive barricades. Workers left the factory and took up arms to go into battle. Occasionally, civilians would go into battle with no weapons at all. The stance on Stalingrad was made clear, as stated by Lieutenant General Vasily Shukov of the Russian 62nd Army. We will defend the city or die in the attempt. 4 battles fought north of the city, known collectively as the Kotluban operations, slowed the German advance, buying the defenders vital time. The battles, however, did result in 200,000 Soviet casualties and were won by the Germans. It is also important to note that the German A Group was so successful in its capturing of the areas to which it was assigned that Hitler ordered elements of that force to combine with the B Group. This recombination of troops, specifically the armored units which met in a rural area in the countryside with poor roads, led to a massive traffic jam that delayed the German advance by about a week. The battle began with a massive aerial bombardment. Bombings on the 23rd through the 25th of July by the Luftflotte 4 decimated the city. During this time frame, 32 Soviet ships were sunk and another 9 crippled, which rendered the Volga unusable. This is devastating since the city relied on the passage of goods across the river in order to supply the town, especially since the harvest victory had caused food shortages even before the bombing. During the later segment of the summer, the German bombardments began to focus on the city itself. An attack on August 23rd caused a firestorm. 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the city within a 2-day time span. 1,000 were killed and over 1,000 were injured. In addition to this, the city was now reduced largely to bombed-out structures. The bombs had blown holes in wall faces and cleared out floors, but in many cases had failed to bring down the modern steel and concrete reinforced structure of the building. This created a perfect nest for snipers and would plague the Germans for the remainder of the battle. In order to maintain air superiority, the Luftwaffe quickly set about destroying over 200 aircraft belonging to the Soviet Air Force in the area surrounding Stalingrad. When the German armored units arrived at the outskirts of the city, they met strong resistance from an anti-aircraft division, mainly made up of young female volunteers who were poorly trained. Despite this, they proved a formidable foe until all of their batteries were eventually overran by panzers. A militia made up of workers initially resisted the Germans, as well as several makeshift tanks made from leftover tractor parts by patriotic technical students. By the end of August, the Germans had reached the Volga north of Stalingrad and pressed towards the river along the rest of the front near the city. This offensive forced the Soviets to fall back to more heavily reinforced positions deeper within the city. On the 5th and the 18th of September, the Soviets launched a massive attack, but it was repulsed by the Luftwaffe. However, the offensive on the 18th allowed some Soviet infantry to anchor themselves in several houses and factories, which allowed them to begin to set up a reinforced defensive line within the city. Both sides pressed on. The Germans launched an attack, pushing the Soviets all the way back to the central railroad station, but failed to advance any further. By this point, the German offensive was losing momentum as Soviet reinforcements poured across the Volga. In the grain elevator to the south, a fierce battle raged for 5 days, and defenders survived through 10 different attempts to assault their position before finally running out of food and water. It was discovered only 40 Soviets had resisted the capture of the elevator. The Soviets set up sniper and machine gun nests and bombed out buildings as close to the Germans as possible. This way, any reinforcement or movement would be hindered if the Germans were to advance. They would almost instantly be surrounded on all sides by Russian gunfire. Small units of 5 to 10 men on both sides would fight in bitter combat in order to advance room by room. In the streets, combatants would be shot without ever seeing their killers, and bombings as well as artillery would kill indiscriminately. Due to the damage left by the German bombardments, soldiers could shoot through holes in the walls and floors, which made any advances even slower. Once a position was lost, an attempt was immediately made to retake it, resulting in strategic points being changed hands dozens of times in the most extreme cases. Examples of heroism of the common soldier, rising out of such brutal conditions, is one of the few positive aspects of the battle. For example, a Soviet sergeant by the name of Yakov Pavlov fortified a 4-story apartment building overlooking the water in order to protect the river. They added a minefield to the front yard, machine guns and barbed wire to the windows, and even renovated the basement to set up a communications room. Their fortification was so impressive that they had turned what was once a bombed-out house into such an obstacle that it was later discovered that German maps labeled it as a fortress. After battling in the house for 2 months straight, they were finally relieved, and Pavlov won the Hero of the Soviet Union for his actions. Snipers hiding in these fortifications played a crucial part in the battle, with one Soviet sniper by the name of Vasily Zaitsev personally killing 225 Axis soldiers over the course of the battle. This sort of tactic, as well as fortification of civilian buildings, greatly frustrated the Wehrmacht, both on a strategic level as well as an individual level. Germans felt this sort of warfare was improper and named it Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. The battle was very much dehumanizing. Horrible weather, fatigue, improper medical treatment, and desensitization towards death and killing all made the battle miserable. In an attempt to flatten the city, as well as better fight in the style to which they were accustomed, the Germans attempted to raise the city. Constant bombardment by the Luftwaffe and artillery had little effect. While the city was unsuitable for human habitation, the bombardments failed to crush the well-built Soviet infrastructure. It must also be mentioned that the Germans tried very hard to destroy the city. They even brought in literally the biggest gun in the history of the world. This weapon, the Schwere Gustav, fired shells with an 80-centimeter diameter and took half an hour to reload. 3 months after the beginning of the battle, the Germans reached the Volga and had captured 90% of the city. At a dinner in Munich, Hitler declared that the German forces had essentially defeated the Soviets at Stalingrad. However, what German intelligence failed to note was the massive buildup of Soviet forces around to the north and the south. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus. A massive attack from the north and south by Soviet tank and infantry punched through the weak German defensive lines and surrounded the city. The German 6th Army, including its commander Friedrich Paulus, and elements of the 4th Army, were now surrounded on all sides by Russian troops. The supply line for reinforcements and equipment had also been cut off. When Paulus requested permission to break through Soviet lines and reunite with the German front line, Hitler denied his request. Instead, he had Goering attempt to supply the city by airlift. This failed miserably and resulted in an insufficient quantity of food and equipment brought in, and many German transport aircraft being shot down. The fighting within the city had become desperate, and by this point the Russian winter was quickly approaching. Ill-prepared German troops would freeze in temperatures that were well below zero, and poor weather further prevented supplies from reaching the city. The Soviets, on the other hand, were relatively well prepared for the winter, and continued putting increasing pressure on the Germans. It is important to note why the Soviets were so ruthless. The Soviet Union had literally lost millions of men to Operation Barbarossa, and now many soldiers had their families behind German lines. The Nazis, especially the SS, treated Slavic people very poorly. Besides the brutal execution of resistance fighters, they also killed Jews, communists, and intellectuals. On numerous occasions, they would also enter villages and kill everyone they found in retaliation for attacks by resistance fighters. There were also a large number of German military brothels, into which many girls living in occupied territory were forced. All of these atrocities, combined with the love of the Russian motherland and communism, inspired the Red Army to throw everything they had at the fascists. By this point, the battle was going horribly for the German Sixth Army trapped in the Stalingrad pocket. The airfield on which the Germans relied for the limited supplies that they were able to take in was captured by Soviet tanks on the 23rd of December. With their main airfield taken, the Germans had significantly less supplies, but the fight went on. It was reported that soldiers were now eating raw horse flesh, and that there were 18,000 wounded, but without a single bandage between them. On the 19th of January, the last flight out of Stalingrad took off before the last airfield was captured. By this point, the Germans were not only starving, but were also running out of ammunition. There were no working German tanks within the city. They were being pushed back to the city center and the Volga, much like the Soviets had during the opening weeks of the battle. Shortly after the capture of the last airfield, the Soviets sent Paulus a message which guaranteed safety of prisoners and food if they were to surrender. Paulus did not respond. On the 22nd of January, Paulus requested to surrender, but Hitler refused. He stated, "The Sixth Army will do its historic duty at Stalingrad to the last man." On the 28th of January, the pocket within Stalingrad had been split into three separate parts. It was reported that there were 50,000 wounded. On the 30th of January, 1 decade since Hitler had came to power, he promoted Paulus to General Field Marshal and noted in his message that no German or Prussian field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was supposed to kill himself. However, the next day, Paulus surrendered. On the 2nd of February, the final German North Pocket surrendered, officially ending the battle. However, some 10,000 Germans continued to fight under inhumane conditions until March, by when they had all starved or been killed. 91,000 Axis soldiers had been captured. The Sixth Army, which had marched through France and Poland, had been destroyed. The Axis had suffered 850,000 casualties, and the Russians had suffered 1,129,619 casualties. The battle had lasted 5 months, 1 week, and 3 days. The Germans would never recover from this defeat, and the tide had turned on the Eastern Front. Allocation of resources away from other fronts to Stalingrad had weakened the German military capabilities. Only 5,000 of the prisoners that were captured would ever return to Germany, and some wouldn't return until 1955. The defeat at Stalingrad had ultimately heralded the defeat of Germany.